All right, hello once again. This is Jeff Scott of Rankin Technical College, and I've been going over the PowerPoint presentations for Murox ASP.NET 4.6 with C# 2015 6th edition. I am in the middle of Chapter 17, which is on how to use object data sources with AWD.NET, and I left off on page 612, how to create a data access class. And it says on that page, the most challenging aspect of using object data sources is developing the data access classes they require. Now, these data access classes, the ones that are used by an object data source control, can have 4 different types of methods, and those are shown on the screen right here. In other words, those methods used to select, insert, update, and delete data. You can use any method names you want for these, and you can design the class so that it has more than one of each of these. For example, the product DB that we just looked at had 2 different select methods. It had get all categories and get products by category. Now, the select methods retrieve data from a database, and it returns it as an IEnumerable object, which we'll talk about a bit more in a bit. The insert inserts data for one row into the underlying database with the values for the new row passed in as one or more parameters. The update updates the data for one row in the underlying database. The values for the updated row, along with any values used to implement optimistic concurrency, are passed in via one or more parameters. And delete deletes a row from the underlying database with the key or keys for the row to be deleted, along with any values used to implement optimistic concurrency passed via one or more parameters. Now, these data access methods can be static or they can be instance methods. What's the difference? If it's a static method, it belongs to the class. So you don't need to create an instance of the class to be able to call it. If it's an instance method, that means that each instance has its own copy, so the instance must call it. So if you define them as instance methods, the object data source control will create an instance of the data access class before it calls the method. Then it'll destroy that object after the method has been executed. Because creating and destroying a data access object can affect performance, some people prefer to use the static method for the select, insert, update, and delete methods whenever possible. All right. The object data source control must use a .NET feature called reflection that we're going to look at in a little more depth and breadth of coverage in just a minute. But reflection is used to determine if a method it calls contains the correct parameters. Reflection is also used to determine the return type of a select method. Reflection is a .NET feature that provides information about compiled classes at runtime. So, how does an object determine which method to call? Well, as mentioned here, the name of the method is specified by the select method, insert method, update method, or delete method property. You would sure think that it would make sense for you to use a name that would be indicative of the operation that you're about to perform. Although that's not mandatory to do that, it makes your program much more intuitive. The object data source control determines what parameters are passed or need to be passed to the data access methods based on what you're inserting, updating, or deleting, and also whether or not you're using optimistic concurrency. All right? Remember, you use optimistic concurrency so you don't have that last in wins mentality. The idea with optimistic concurrency is if somebody is working on, and you can set it up for different levels, but on a database or on a table or on a record, and somebody else tries changing the same thing, they're prohibited from doing so. Again, the object data source control uses reflection to determine the parameter signatures. The signatures are what basically exists inside of the parentheses. All right. At runtime, if the class doesn't provide a method with the correct name and parameters, then, as mentioned, an exception will be thrown. So, here's the allowable return types. The first shown there is IEnumerable. Again, an enumeration, for lack of better words, is typically defined something like as a user-defined data type. So an IEnumerable is a collection. It can be an array list. It can be a strongly typed collection. All right. A data table returns just that, a data table. The object data source control automatically extracts a data view from the table and uses the view for data binding. A data set returns a data set, where the object data control extracts a data view from the first data table in the data set and uses this view for data binding. Or an object, where the select method returns an object. Then the object data source control wraps the object in an IEnumerable collection with just one item. Then it does the data binding. So this figure is designed to show you how to design and code between this and the code that follows, and it's pretty heavy. So it shows you how to design and code a select method that can be used with an object data source. All right. This table that we just looked at lists the 4 different types of values that a select method can return. The simplest and the one that I've seen used the most often is the IEnumerable. But again, the select method can also return a data table, a data set object, or an object itself. If the select method returns a data set, the object data source can cache the data. So, what about update, delete, and insert? Well, remember, select allows you to view the data. Select means you cannot change the underlying data. It is not considered permissible. So if you want to change the data, you're going to have to use an update if you want to change existing data, an insert if you want to add new data, or a delete if you want to remove existing data. So the data access class used by the object data source can provide methods for update, delete, and insert. They mention on page 616 that before you code these methods, you need to determine the required parameters. So what's shown here is a summary of how an object data source generates these parameters. Any insert or delete requires a single business object as the parameter. On the other hand, with an update, if the update provides for optimistic concurrency checking, it requires 2 parameters. And you see in this case, we're doing an update, and you can see the 2 parameters. One parameter must be the business object that provides the original values for the row to be updated, and the other is a business object that provides the new parameters. 2 parameters are also required if the key column for a table is updatable. The business objects that you pass to update, delete, and insert are defined by the class that's defined on the data object type name property of the object data source. This class must provide a parameterless constructor, so it must provide a constructor that has nothing passed to it. Second, the class must provide a public property for each bound field that's passed. This, again, as mentioned, is about as heavy as it gets. Chapter 17 and 18, as I previously mentioned to you, if they're not the 2 hardest chapters in the book, I don't know of any chapters that are more difficult. So, how are these parameters generated? Let's blow this up a bit. All right. When the insert or delete method is called, one method of the business class type is generated and passed to the method. One parameter of the business class type is also generated and passed to the update method. In both cases, these can be any name you want it to be. Again, if optimistic concurrency is specified, then you need 2 parameters. As far as requirements for the business class, this is shown from the bottom of page 617. The class must provide a parameterless constructor. The class must have public properties with names that match the name of the bound fields, and the public properties must have both get and set accessors. Next, the property for each bound field must include both gets and sets, and you should know that you don't have to use business objects as the parameters. Rather, you can use a parameter for each bound field that's required by the method. So, what are the attributes for marking data classes? Well, the figure that's shown on page 619 shows how you can use C# attributes to identify a data access class and its methods. These provide a way to provide declarative information for classes, for methods, for properties, etc. And we've seen these here and here. Now there's data object and there's data object method. The data object class is data object true. There's also, for the data object method, there's types select, insert, update, and delete. So you can use these to do what's called mark the classes and the methods. Visual Studio then uses these to determine which classes and methods to list in the drop-down list. So it's a way of making it easier for the system, for lack of better words. All right, what's discussed next, and I know I'm only 11 minutes in here, but I'd like to stop right now because I'd like to next go through this category maintenance application, and that's the next 2, 4, 6, 8. That's the next 10 pages. Afterwards, we've got 2, 4, 6 pages that discuss how to use paging and sorting, all right, with this stuff. So I'm going to stop right now, and I'll continue on with, I believe this is the end of part 3. In fact, let me check. So yeah, this is the end of part 3, and I'll come back with part 4 momentarily.